An old woman inherited a house the whole town swore was cursed, and behind a wall in its lowest room, she found something that rewrote the last years of her life. The letter came on a Tuesday, which Eleanor Caldwell would remember afterward because Tuesdays had always been the day she let herself do nothing. No appointments, no errands she could put off, no reason to be anywhere but the small kitchen of the rented house on Pearl Street, where the morning light fell across the table in a long pale rectangle that moved as the hours passed. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She was 73 years old. Her hands had begun to ache in the cold the way her mother's had, and she had learned to wrap them around a warm cup before she tried to do anything that required her fingers to be steady. The cup that morning was tea gone lukewarm, and she had been sitting with it for the better part of an hour when she heard the mail slot rattle in the front door. There were 3 envelopes. 2 of them she knew at a glance, because she had learned the particular shape of bad news. One was from the county, the kind with the cellophane window, and her name printed by a machine. The other was from the medical group that had sent her a different version of the same paper every month since Walter died. She set those 2 face down on the counter without opening them, the way a person sets aside something hot. The 3rd envelope was different. It was heavier, the paper thick and slightly textured, and the return address in the corner belonged to a firm she had never heard of. Pruitt and Vance, attorneys, with a street number in a town 2 hours north that she had passed through maybe twice in her life. She almost did not open it. She thought it might be another claim, some debt of Walter's she had not yet learned about, surfacing now the way they did, months after a person was gone, as if the dead left small fuses behind them that burned at different speeds. But the envelope had her name written by hand on the front, in ink, and that was unusual enough that she found the letter opener in the drawer and slid it along the top. The letter inside was a single page, formal and careful in its language. It informed her that she was named as the principal beneficiary in the estate of Edmund Caldwell, lately deceased, and that the firm would be obliged if she would contact them at her earliest convenience to discuss the disposition of the property at Aldercroft House. There was a phone number. There was a line that said the matter was time-sensitive only in the gentlest sense, and that there was no cause for alarm. And there was the name, Edmund Caldwell, which she had not heard spoken aloud in years and had not expected to ever hear again. Eleanor put the letter down and looked out the window at the back garden, which was not really a garden anymore, only a square of grass that the landlord's man cut every few weeks and a fence that leaned a little more each winter. She knew the name. Edmund had been Walter's uncle, his father's older brother, a man she had met exactly twice in 50 years of marriage. The first time had been at her own wedding, where Edmund had stood at the back of the small church in a dark coat and had left before the reception without speaking to anyone. The second time had been at the funeral of Walter's father, where Edmund had come and gone like weather, present for an hour, gone before the family had finished its first round of casseroles and condolences. He had been old even then, decades ago. She had assumed, when she thought of him at all, which was almost never, that he had died long ago in whatever house had swallowed him. Apparently he had not. Apparently he had died only recently, an old man in an old house, and apparently, for reasons the letter did not explain, he had left that house to her. She made the call the following morning. The voice that answered belonged to a man named Pruitt, who sounded younger than she expected, and who spoke with the practiced patience of someone used to explaining the same things to people in shock. The situation, he told her, was a little unusual but not complicated. Edmund Caldwell had drawn up his last will more than 30 years ago and had never changed it. In that will, he had left the entirety of his estate to his nephew Walter, the only member of the family, Pruitt said carefully, with whom the deceased appeared to have maintained any contact at all. Walter had died 8 months before Edmund. Under the terms of the will and the law that governed it, the inheritance passed to Walter's surviving spouse, which was her. "What is there?" Eleanor asked. "To inherit?" There was a pause on the line, the small hesitation of a man choosing his words. The principal asset, Pruitt said, was the house itself, along with the land it stood on. He described it as a substantial property, historically significant in the area, though he was obliged to tell her that it had been unoccupied except by Mr. Caldwell himself for a great many years and was, by all accounts, in a considerable state of disrepair. There were also, he said, some debts against the estate, primarily unpaid taxes that had accrued over a long period. He wanted her to understand that the inheritance was not, in the ordinary sense, a windfall. It might, he said gently, be more accurate to think of it as a responsibility. Eleanor thanked him and said she would think about it and would call again. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the 2 unopened envelopes still face down on the counter behind her and the will of a man she had met twice spread out in front of her. To understand why she did not simply refuse, the way any sensible person would have refused, you would have to understand the exact shape of the corner she was sitting in that winter. Walter had been a good man and a careful one, and for 49 years they had lived a life that was never comfortable but was never quite frightening either. He had worked at the plant out by the river until it closed, and after that he had done whatever there was to do, and they had raised their children and buried one of them and grown old in a series of small houses, none of which they had ever owned. There had been a plan, the modest sort of plan that careful people make. And then Walter's heart had begun to fail, slowly, over 3 years, and the plan had been spent the way water is spent, a little at a time, and then all at once, on doctors and on the medicines that kept him, and on the hospital, where he had finally died on a gray afternoon in March with Eleanor holding the hand that had held hers since she was 24. What was left after that was the arithmetic. The county letter on the counter was about the back rent. The medical letter was about the part of Walter's care that the insurance had decided, after he was already gone, that it would not cover after all. Between the two of them, they came to a little under $30,000, which to some people was a number you could write a check for, and to Eleanor was a number with no bottom. She had her widow's portion of Walter's small pension, which was enough to keep her in tea and to keep the lights on if she was careful, and which was not enough for anything more than that. The landlord had been kind for as long as kindness was free to him. He had told her, in the soft, regretful way of a man who has decided something and wants to be liked for it anyway, that he would need the house back by spring. So she was 73 years old, and she was 8 months a widow, and she was going to lose the roof over her head in a season's time, and a letter had arrived telling her that she owned a house. It did not matter, in that first reckoning, that the house was 2 hours away and falling down and burdened with debts of its own. It was a house. It had walls and a roof, and it belonged, by some strange turn of paper and death, to her. A drowning person does not ask whether the thing floating past is beautiful. She told her son first, because she thought she should, and because some part of her wanted to be talked out of the hope before it grew teeth. David lived 3 states away now, in a city, with a job that kept him on planes and a family she saw in photographs more than in life. She caught him on a Thursday evening when she could hear, behind his voice, the sounds of a house with money in it, the dishwasher running, a television, a child being told to do something. She told him about the letter and the will and the house, and there was a silence on the line that she had learned to read the way she had learned to read envelopes. "Mom," David said. "Aldercroft. You're talking about the Caldwell place. Out past Ledford. You know it. Everybody knows it. Dad used to talk about it." A pause. "You can't be serious about this." She asked him what he meant, and he told her, in the tone of a man explaining the obvious to someone he loves and does not entirely trust, what the Caldwell place was. It was a ruin, he said. It had been a ruin his whole life. It was the kind of house that towns told stories about, the big dark shape on the ridge that you dared each other to walk up to when you were a kid, and that nobody ever actually went near. There had been deaths there, he said, vaguely, the way a thing is true in a family without anyone being able to say exactly how they know it. A fire, a long time ago. Somebody who fell. The old man himself, Edmund, who had shut himself up in there for 40 years, and never came out, and never let anyone in, and went strange, everybody said, went strange and stayed strange until he died in there alone. The place was cursed, David said, and then he laughed at himself for saying it, the embarrassed laugh of a grown man who does not believe in curses and is repeating one anyway, because some things you absorb before you are old enough to refuse them. "It's not cursed," Eleanor said. "It's just a house an old man wouldn't leave." "It's a money pit," David said. "Whatever it is. Mom, the taxes alone. You'd be taking on his debts on top of your own. You'd be pouring money you don't have into a building you can't sell, in a town nobody wants to live in, 2 hours from your doctor and your church and everybody who knows you. Sign it away. Pruitt can handle it. Let the county take it for the back taxes and walk away clean. He was not wrong. That was the thing she would turn over many times in the weeks that followed. By every measure that could be written on paper, David was right, and she knew he was right, and she also knew that he was speaking from a house with a dishwasher running, and that the distance between his certainty and her situation was exactly the distance between $30,000 being a check and $30,000 being the sea. He told her he loved her and that he just wanted what was best for her, and that they would figure out the spring. They would find her somewhere. There were places, there were programs. He said the word programs the way you say a word you hope will end a conversation. She told him she would think about it. She did not tell him that the word programs had put a cold weight in her stomach, because she knew what those places were and she had visited enough of them, sitting with friends in their last small rooms, to know that what he was offering her, kindly, was the slow surrender of every remaining thing that was hers. The rest of the family was less kind, because the rest of the family had less reason to be careful with her. Word travels through a family the way damp travels through a wall, and within 2 weeks of the letter Eleanor had heard, through one channel and another, what the cousins thought. Walter had cousins scattered around the county, the broad, shallow root system of an old name gone to seed, and several of them had opinions about the will that they were not shy about sharing. The general feeling, as it reached her, was that there had been some mistake, that Edmund had meant to leave the place to the family, to all of them, and that the only reason a widow nobody had spoken to in years had ended up with it was that the old man had been too far gone to update his papers. One of them, a man named Royce who ran a sign business out by the highway and whom Eleanor had met perhaps 4 times, went so far as to call her directly to suggest, in a voice that worked hard at sounding reasonable, that the decent thing, the family thing, would be for her to sell the property and divide whatever it brought among Edmund's blood relations. It was not really hers, he explained, not in the way that mattered. She had married into the name. She had not been born to it. He was sure she understood. Eleanor listened to all of it and said very little. She had spent a long life being a person other people did not need to take seriously, a quiet woman in the background of louder lives, and she had learned that silence is often mistaken for agreement and that this misunderstanding can be useful. She let them think what they thought, but somewhere under the silence, in a part of her she had not visited in some time, something had begun to set itself against the whole chorus of them, against David's programs and Royce's decent thing, and the easy certainty of everyone who had a roof and did not have to think about losing it. They had all decided, without seeing it, without going there, what the house was. They had decided it was nothing, a ruin, a curse, a burden to be shed. And the only thing Eleanor knew for certain, the only fact in the whole affair that was actually hers, was that an old man she had met twice had chosen, out of an entire family that had written him off, to leave everything he had to the one branch that had ever shown him a moment's kindness. Walter, she remembered now, had sent Edmund a card every Christmas. Every single year, for half a century, a card with a few lines in it, to an uncle who never wrote back. She had addressed some of those cards herself. A man does not give his whole life's house to people who send him Christmas cards if the house is nothing. She decided to go and see it. Not to accept it, she told herself, only to see it. She owed the dead at least that much, to look at the thing with her own eyes before she let strangers decide its fate. She called Pruitt and arranged to collect the keys, and she asked him, almost as an afterthought, whether there was anyone who could tell her about the house's condition before she made the drive. He hesitated again, the way he had at the start, and then he gave her a name. There was a man in Ledford, he said, who had done some caretaking work on the property over the years, the little that anyone would do. Hollis. He could probably tell her what she was getting into. The drive north took her out of the flat, familiar country she had lived in all her life, and up into the folded hills where the towns got smaller and farther apart, and the trees came down close to the road. It was late February, the worst of the cold past, but the green not yet arrived, and the land had the gray, scoured look of a thing waiting. She drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, because the roads were not roads she knew, and because her hands ached, and because she was in no hurry to arrive at whatever she was driving toward. Ledford, when she reached it, was smaller even than she had imagined. A single main street with more dark windows than lit ones. A gas station, a diner, a hardware store, a church with its paint peeling, a few side streets of old houses settling on their foundations. It was the kind of town that had been built for something that had since gone away, and that remained mostly out of the stubbornness of the people too old or too poor to leave. She thought, with a small private bleakness, that it was a town very much like her own situation, and she did not know whether that made her like it more or less. She found Hollis at the hardware store, because that was where Pruitt had said he was usually to be found, and because in a town that size there were not many places to look. He was a heavy, slow-moving man somewhere past 60, with the broad, cracked hands of someone who had worked outdoors his whole life, and a way of looking at a person from under his eyebrows that was not unfriendly, but was in no hurry to decide. When she told him who she was and why she had come, something moved across his face, a recognition, and underneath it something she could not at first name. He set down the box of bolts he had been sorting and looked at her for a long moment. "So you're the one," he said. "I suppose I am." He nodded slowly. He told her he had heard the place was passing to somebody from Edmund's family, and that he had wondered who would be fool enough to take it. He said the word fool without any unkindness, as a man uses a word he has used about himself. Then he told her he would drive up with her if she liked, because the road to Aldercroft was not a road most cars could manage anymore, and because, he said, looking at her under those eyebrows, it was not a house he would let a person walk into alone the first time. She asked him why not, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that everybody had their reasons for staying away from that house, and that his were his own, and that she would see soon enough. They went in his truck, an old thing that rode high and rattled over the broken pavement as the town fell away behind them and the road climbed. He talked a little as he drove, in the slow way of a man who has decided to tell you something and is finding the order of it. He had known Edmund, he said, as much as anyone had known Edmund, which was not much. For close to 20 years, he had been the one who brought the old man his supplies, left them at the gate because Edmund would not have anyone pass the gate, hauled away what needed hauling, fixed the few things Edmund would allow to be fixed, which was almost nothing, because the old man seemed to want the place to fall down around him a little at a time, like he was matching its decline to his own. He had never once been inside the house. In 20 years, Edmund had paid him in cash left in a tin by the gatepost, the same amount every month, and had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in all those years, always at the gate, always briefly, and always, Hollis said, with the eyes of a man who was watching something behind you that you could not see. Was he mad? Eleanor asked. People say he was mad. Hollis took a while to answer. People say a lot of things, he said. I'll tell you what I think. I don't think he was mad. I think he was guarding something. A man doesn't shut himself up for 40 years over nothing. He guards something, or he hides from something. And Edmund didn't act like a man hiding. He acted like a man on watch. He glanced at her. But that's just an old fool's notion. Could be he was just lonely and strange and old, like everybody says. The town likes the curse better. It's a better story than a lonely old man. The curse, he told her, was older than Edmund. It went back to the Caldwells who had built the place generations ago, when the family had money and the house was new and the grandest thing for 50 miles. He gave her the bones of it as the truck climbed through the trees. The man who built Aldercroft had made his fortune in something nobody quite remembered and had built the house to last 1,000 years, and his sons had lost the fortune the way fortunes get lost, and the family had folded in on itself, smaller and poorer with each generation, until there was only the house left, too big and too expensive to keep and too proud to sell. There had been a fire, some time back before the war, that had killed 2 people in the East Wing, and that had never been fully explained. There had been a young woman of the family, a long time ago, who had fallen from the gallery inside the main hall and broken her neck on the stone floor below, and the town could not agree, even now, on whether she had fallen or been pushed or jumped. There had been a stretch of years when the house stood empty and animals would not go near it, when hunters' dogs would stop at the bottom of the drive and would not climb. And then Edmund had come, the last Caldwell, an old man already, and had moved into the rotting house alone and had pulled the door shut behind him and had not opened it again for the rest of his life. The dogs were the part the town held on to hardest, Hollis said, because it was the part you could not argue away. Hunters had worked these hills for as long as there had been a Ledford, and every man who ever brought a dog up the slope toward Aldercroft told the same story. Good dogs, brave dogs. dogs that would put their heads down a bear's den, would reach a certain line at the bottom of the drive and stop, and would not be moved, not by command and not by the leash. They would stand there with their hackles up, looking at the house, making a low sound in their chests, until their owners gave up and turned back. Nobody could explain it. The town did not try very hard to explain it. The town simply added it to the pile, alongside the fire and the fallen girl and the empty years, and called the whole pile a curse, and was satisfied. Eleanor listened to all of it without saying much, watching the trees go by the window, and what struck her was not the fear in the stories but the shape of them. Every one of them did the same work. Every one of them said, in its own way, stay away. 100 years of reasons to stay away. She did not know yet what to make of that, but she filed it where she filed the things she meant to come back to. That's the curse, Hollis said. That's all it is. A pile of old bad luck and a town with nothing better to talk about. But I'll tell you this. The truck came around a long curve, and the trees fell back, and he slowed, and then stopped, and he pointed up the slope ahead of them. You stand here, and you look at it, and you tell me you don't feel anything. Eleanor looked. Aldercroft House stood on the high ground at the end of the climbing drive, against a sky the color of slate, and even half ruined. Even seen through a screen of bare branches and 100 years of neglect, it was the largest and the heaviest and the most deliberate thing she had ever seen made by people. It was built of a dark gray stone that the weather had stained darker, 3 stories of it, with a steep slate roof broken in places to the rafters and a row of tall windows along the front that caught no light because there was no light behind them, only the flat black of empty rooms. Ivy had climbed the whole eastern face and pulled some of it down. One wing, the east wing, she would learn, had collapsed at the far end into a heap of stone and timber that the forest had begun to take. Trees had grown up close against the walls, close enough to touch them, as if the woods had spent the empty decades creeping forward inch by inch to lay its hands on the place. The windows were dark and tall, and there were a great many of them. And looking up at them from the bottom of the drive, Eleanor had the exact sensation that Hollis had promised her she would have, the sensation of being looked at by something that was not there, the old animal feeling of standing at the mouth of a cave and being aware of a depth inside it that your eyes could not reach. She did not say that she felt nothing. She was too honest for that, and Hollis would have known she was lying. She said, instead, after a long moment, "It's beautiful." Hollis turned and looked at her, and something in his weathered face shifted, surprise, and then something gentler than surprise. "Most people say it's frightening," he said. "It's that too," Eleanor said. "But somebody built that to be loved. You don't make a thing that careful unless you mean for it to be loved. It's just been a long time since anybody did." He put the truck back in gear and drove the rest of the way up the drive in silence. Up close the house was worse, and somehow also better than it had looked from below. Worse, because the decay that distance had softened was, at the foot of the walls, a kind of slow violence. The stone cracked and shifting, the gutters fallen, the great front door swollen and gray and webbed with the dried stems of dead ivy. Better, because up close she could see the work in it, the way every stone had been cut and set by a hand that cared, the carving over the doorway worn almost smooth but still there, a pattern of leaves and a shape that might once have been a family crest. The grounds had gone entirely to wilderness. What had been a forecourt was a thicket. What had been gardens were a memory under the brambles. But the bones of it, the great patient bones of the place, were still sound enough to stand, and Eleanor, getting slowly down from the high seat of the truck with Hollis's hand under her elbow, felt the strangest thing of all, which was not fear, though there was fear, and was not greed, though heaven knew she had reason for greed. What she felt, standing in the ruined forecourt of a house she had owned for 2 weeks and had never seen, was a kind of recognition. As if the house and the old woman were 2 things the world had set aside and forgotten, and had each been waiting, in their separate decay, for someone to come and look at them and see that they were still there. Hollis worked the front door open for her, which took both of his big hands and a shoulder and the better part of 5 minutes, the swollen wood shrieking against the frame. When it finally gave, a breath of air came out of the house, cool and dry and old, smelling of dust and stone, and something faintly sweet underneath, the smell of paper and time. He stepped back and let her go first, and she understood that this was not courtesy. This was his line. He had brought her up the mountain, and he had opened the door, and he was not going to cross the threshold. 20 years of leaving things at the gate had made a wall in him that her arrival was not going to take down. "I'll wait out here," he said. "Take your time. You holler if you need me." Eleanor stepped inside. The entrance hall of Aldercroft was a tall stone room that rose the full 3 stories of the house to a ceiling lost in shadow, with a great staircase climbing one wall to a gallery that ran around the upper level, the same gallery, she would realize later, from which a girl had fallen 100 years ago. The floor was stone, gray flagstones gone pale with dust. The light came in through the tall front windows and slanted columns thick with floating moats. And in those columns the room was almost beautiful, and beyond them it sank into a darkness her eyes had to work to enter. There was furniture, shrouded in dust sheets gone gray, the humped shapes of chairs and tables under their coverings like sleeping animals. There was a smell that was not the smell of abandonment she had braced for. Abandoned houses, she knew from a long life, smelled of rot and damp and the slow surrender of things to weather. This smelled of dust and dryness and care. The roof leaked, she could see the stains, but somehow the place beneath had been kept. Somehow Edmund had fought the water off the rooms that mattered, and the result was a house that did not feel dead so much as sleeping, holding its breath, waiting. She stood very still in the long light and let her eyes adjust and listened. The house was silent in a way she had never heard silence. Not empty silence, which has a hollowness to it. This was a full silence, a held silence, the silence of a room where something is being kept. She found that her heart was going faster than it should, and she made herself breathe, and she said, aloud, to no one, in a voice that the stone took and flattened and gave back to her smaller than she had said it, "All right. I'm here. Let's have a look at you." She began to walk. She went slowly, because the floor was uneven and her hands had a flashlight that Hollis had pressed on her, and that shook a little in her grip, and because every part of her that had absorbed 73 years of caution was telling her to be careful in this place. She passed out of the great hall into the rooms beyond it, and one by one the house showed her its long sleep. A drawing room with the furniture all shrouded and a fireplace big enough to stand in, the marble of it cracked but grand. A dining room with a table under its sheet that must have seated 20, and a sideboard, and on the sideboard, when she lifted the corner of a cloth, a set of plates stacked with a neatness that stopped her, that did not belong in a ruin, that spoke of a hand that had put them there in order and meant to come back. Beyond the dining room, a corridor ran back into the body of the house, away from the tall front windows and the generous light, and the deeper she followed it, the more the place changed its character. The grand rooms gave way to smaller ones, and the smaller ones did not behave the way rooms in a home behave. She opened a door onto a chamber barely larger than a closet, windowless, with a narrow iron cot folded against one wall and a single shelf bolted into the stone above it, and nothing else. No hearth, no comfort, no reason for a room like that to exist in a house built to impress. She opened another and found shelving from floor to ceiling, heavy shelving braced with metal set deep into the masonry, the kind of bracing you build to carry a great weight, and every shelf was empty, swept clean, with only the faint pale ghosts in the dust where heavy things had once stood and had been taken away. She stood in that doorway with the flashlight moving slowly across the empty braces, and the cold came up in her again, because shelves built that strong told a story all their own. Something had been kept there, something heavy enough to need iron, and someone had moved it. The corridor turned, and turned again, and she began to understand that the house was deeper than its face. From the drive it had looked like a single great block of stone, but inside it folded back on itself, room behind room, passage behind passage, and the further she went from the windows the harder it became to hold the shape of it in her mind. She passed doors that were locked, their handles stiff and cold under her hand, and she did not force them, partly out of caution, and partly out of a feeling she could not have defended, which was that this was Edmund's house still, that he had only just left it, and that a person did not break down the doors of a house whose owner might at any moment come around the corner and ask what she thought she was doing. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. She came to one door that was not like the others. A door of plate iron set flush into the stone, with no handle at all, only a keyhole and a row of heavy bolts gone orange with rust. She stood before it for a long moment with her hand flat against the cold metal, and she had the unmistakable sense that whatever the rest of the house was hiding, this door was the place it had decided to hide it. It did not move. She had not expected it to, but she marked the spot in her mind, the way Hollis marked the gate, and she went on. Somewhere deep in the stone the house made a sound, a low settling groan of old timber easing in the cold, and Eleanor stood very still in the dark of the folded corridor until it passed. Then she turned back toward the light, retracing her steps past the empty brace shelves and the windowless cell, out into the front of the house and the gray daylight, toward the one room she had not yet truly entered. A library, and at the door of the library she stood for a long time with the flashlight moving over shelf after shelf of books climbing into the dark, hundreds of them, thousands, their spines furred with dust but unbroken, untouched. An entire life's reading kept dry against the weather while the roof came down 2 rooms away. She thought, standing among those dry, untouched books, about what it must have taken. A house this size, this old, this far gone, wanted to die. Everything in nature wanted to pull it down. The rain and the frost and the slow, patient roots and the weight of its own stone. And a house left to itself in these hills would be a green mound in 50 years and a memory in 100. To keep even a part of it dry, to keep the books from the damp and the plates in their order and the lamp glass clean, across 40 years, by the hands of one old man alone, would have been work without end and without thanks. Every leak found and fought. Every winter survived. Every single day a small war against the thing the whole world had already agreed to let win. Nobody does that for nothing, Eleanor thought. Nobody gives 40 years of his one life to holding the rain off a ruin unless the ruin is keeping something he loves more than his comfort, more than his name, more than the good opinion of a town that called him mad for staying. She had spent the last 3 years of her own life in exactly that kind of war, holding the water off Walter day by day, and she knew the shape of it from the inside. She recognized it now in the dry, quiet rooms around her the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you loved. Edmund had not been hiding in this house. He had been keeping it. There was a world of difference between the two, and she was perhaps the only person who had walked through that door in 40 years who understood it. It was in the library that she found the first of the small wrong things, the things that did not fit the story of the mad, lonely old man, the things that were the beginning of everything that came after. The library had a desk, a great dark slab of a desk set before the tall window, and the desk was the one surface in all the rooms she had seen that was not under a sheet and not under dust. It had been used, recently used, by the measure of a house that had stood untouched. There was a chair drawn up to it at an angle, as if someone had risen from it and walked away and meant to come back. There was a lamp, an oil lamp, the glass clean. There was an inkstand, and a pen laid across it, and a blotter, and a single sheet of paper squared neatly in the center of the blotter, as though it had been set out and waiting. And there was dust on everything in the room, a soft gray fall of it on the books and the shelves and the floor, on everything except the desk and the chair and the narrow path of floor between the desk and the door, where the dust had been disturbed, worn, walked, by feet going back and forth across years. Eleanor stood at the edge of that worn path with her heart loud in her ears, and she understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and in the body before the mind can put words to it. that the story everyone had told her was wrong. Or at least that it was not the whole story. Edmund Caldwell had not shut himself up in this house to rot and go mad and die. A man who was rotting did not keep his books dry and his plate stacked. A man who was mad did not wear a clean path between his desk and his door for 20 years. Edmund had been doing something in this house. Every day, for 40 years, he had risen and come to this room and sat at this desk in the long window light and done some work that mattered to him enough to fight the weather for, enough to give his whole life to, enough to refuse the world at the gate so that nothing would interrupt it. He had been on watch, Hollis had said. He had been guarding something. And he had left it all, the house and whatever was in it, and whatever it was he had spent 40 years protecting, not to the family that mocked him, but to the one couple who had sent him a card at Christmas, who had not forgotten him, who had, in the smallest possible way, year after year for half a century, simply remembered that he was there. She crossed the worn path to the desk, and with a hand that was no longer shaking, because something steadier than fear had risen up in her and taken hold, she reached out and turned the single sheet of paper toward her and into the light from the window, and she began to read what Edmund Caldwell had written and left squared in the center of the blotter for whoever cared enough to come. The paper was not a letter. That was the first thing that surprised her, because she had half expected a letter, the confession or the farewell of a dying recluse, the thing that would explain everything in a single page. It was nothing so simple. It was a list written in a small, precise hand, the hand of a man who had never wasted a stroke in his life, and at the top of it, underlined once, were 3 words she did not understand. For my heir. Below that, a column of single words and short phrases, 24 of them, numbered, each one apparently complete in itself and apparently meaning nothing. The third stone. The east light at 4. Behind the second face. What the founder kept. Below the level the water knows. They went on like that down the page, each line a small closed door, each one clearly meant to be understood by someone, clearly not meant to be understood by everyone, a private language written for a single reader who had not yet arrived. Eleanor read the list 3 times. She did not understand a word of it, and yet reading it she felt the hair rise on her arms, because there was no longer any possible way to pretend, to herself or to anyone, that she was standing in an empty ruin. This was not a list a man wrote at the end of an empty life. This was a map. A man did not draw a map to nothing. He had written it for an heir he would never meet, a person somewhere in the unknown future who would come into this house when he was gone and stand where she was standing now. And he had left them this, a trail of small closed doors, because whatever he had spent his life guarding was still here, in this house, hidden behind the faces and below the levels and under the patient gray skin of the place. He had not taken his secret to the grave. He had buried it in the house and left the key in plain sight on the desk, and he had trusted, against all the evidence of a family that had forgotten him, that someone would come who was the kind of person who would actually look. She thought of David, who had told her to sign it away. She thought of Royce, who had told her it was not really hers. She thought of the whole town below, 2 hours of it spread out in the gray afternoon, every one of them certain that Aldercroft was a cursed ruin not worth the climb. They had all been wrong. They had been wrong for decades, all of them, and their wrongness had been the very thing that kept the secret safe, because no one guards a thing better than a town that has agreed there is nothing there. Eleanor folded the list once, carefully, and put it in the pocket of her coat, over her heart, where she had carried, on the drive up, the 2 unopened envelopes of her old life. And she stood for a moment in the long light of the library of the house that the world had decided was worthless, and that an old man had decided was hers, and she felt, for the first time in the 8 gray months since Walter died, the thing she had thought she would never feel again. Not hope exactly. It was earlier than hope, and quieter, and harder to kill. It was curiosity. It was the simple animal wish to know what was behind the next door. She took the folded list out again and opened it in the window light and read it once more, slowly, line by line. The way you read a thing written in a language you have only begun to suspect you might learn. The third stone. Behind the second face. Below the level the water knows. They meant nothing to her, and yet they did not feel like the ravings the town would have made of them. They felt like instructions left by a patient man for a patient reader, each one a small knot that would come loose for the person who knew where to put their fingers. And as she stood there with the page in her hand, the light in the window shifted. The sun had moved behind the bare trees on the western ridge and dropped lower, and the slant of it through the tall glass swung across the floor and climbed the eastern wall of the library. And for a moment, as it crossed a particular stretch of paneling, the wood seemed to change. The grain of it stood up sharp and strange in the low gold light in a way it had not in the flat light of the afternoon. Eleanor looked from the wall to the list and back again, and one of the lines she had read 3 times and dismissed rose up off the page and stood in front of her with a new and quiet weight. The east light at 4. She looked at her watch. It was 4:15. She looked again at the wall, where the low sun lay along the paneling, and she did not understand what she was seeing, not yet. But she understood that she was seeing it, that the old man's list and the old house's light had just, for one moment, in front of her eyes, agreed about something. Her hands were not aching anymore. She had stopped noticing them entirely. Outside, in the ruined forecourt, Hollis was leaning against his truck with his arms folded, watching the dark front of the house, and when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, he straightened up and studied her face the way he had studied it in the hardware store, and whatever he saw there made him go still. "Well," he said, "seen enough? You ready to go home and let the county have it?" Eleanor looked back over her shoulder, into the great hall, up the staircase to the gallery and the shadows above, into the held silence of the house that had waited 40 years for someone to come and read what was on the desk. "No," she said, "I don't think I am." The drive back down the mountain that first evening was the longest 2 hours Eleanor had spent since the afternoon she had driven home from the hospital with Walter's coat folded on the seat beside her. Hollis let her out at the hardware store, where she had left her own car, and he sat for a moment with the engine running and looked at her across the cab in the failing light. "You're going to come back up here," he said. It was not a question. "I am. You know how this sounds. A woman your age, moving alone into a place like that. Folks will say the curse got you too." "Folks have been saying things about that house for 100 years, Eleanor said. "Far as I can tell, every single one of them said it from down here, where it was warm." She gathered her purse and the flashlight she had forgotten to give back. "I'll bring this up next time." He almost smiled. "Keep it," he said. "You'll want one that works." And then, as she opened the door, he added, in a different voice, lower, "If you do come back, you don't go down into the bottom of that house alone. The cellars, whatever's under it. You wait for me. I never went past the gate in 20 years, and I'm not going to tell you why, because I don't rightly know why. But you wait for me. Promise an old fool that much." She promised. She did not fully understand what she was promising, but she understood that it had cost him something to ask, and she gave him her word the way you give your word to someone who has earned it without knowing how. The decision to move was not really a decision. That was the thing she could never make David understand in the calls that followed. A decision is a thing you make when you have more than one door. Eleanor had one door, and it was on a ridge above Ledford, and the only other place the world was offering her was the slow surrender of every last thing that was hers into the keeping of strangers who would be kind to her for a fee. She had run the numbers 100 times at the kitchen table on Pearl Street, with the 2 unopened envelopes finally open now and lying flat in front of her, and the numbers always came out the same. She could not pay the back rent. She could not pay the medical debt. She could not, on a widow's portion of a small pension, afford to keep even the little house she was about to lose. What she could do, the one thing left to her, was take the house that already belonged to her, the house no one could put her out of, the house that came with debts of its own, but came also with walls and a roof and rooms enough to be lost in, and live in it, and see what it had to show her. David did not take it well. He called the evening after she told him, and his voice had the tight, controlled patience of a man trying very hard not to frighten his mother. He told her she was not thinking clearly. He told her that grief did strange things to people, that she had lost Dad and now she was reaching for something, anything, and that this house was the worst possible thing to reach for. He offered, again, the programs. He offered to fly out, to help her find a proper place, a safe place, somewhere with people to look in on her. He used the word safe 4 times in one conversation, and each time he used it Eleanor heard underneath it the other word he was too kind to say, which was small. A safe small room, where a safe small old woman could sit out her safe small remaining years and be no trouble to anyone, least of all to a son 3 states away with a job that kept him on planes. "David," she said, when he had run all the way down to the end of his arguments, "do you remember your father sending those cards? To his uncle. Every Christmas." A pause. "Vaguely. Yeah. 50 years he sent them. To a man who never once wrote back. And I used to think it was a little foolish, honestly, sending a card into the dark like that, year after year, to somebody who didn't care." She turned the will over in her hands, the will that had made her, by an accident of paper and death, the owner of a thing the whole world had thrown away. "But your father wasn't foolish. Your father was the only person in this whole family who never gave up on that old man. And do you know what it got him? It got him everything Edmund had. The man left it all to Walter, David. Out of an entire family, he chose your father, because your father was the one who remembered him. I am not reaching for anything. I am going to a place that was given to me by a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and I am going to find out what he meant by it. And I would be glad of your help, but I am going either way." David was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, the patience had gone out of his voice, and something tireder had taken its place. "I can't come right now, Mom. Work is. I can't get away." "I know," she said, and she did know, and she did not hold it against him, because a man with a dishwasher running and children to feed cannot drop the whole weight of his life to climb a mountain after his mother's ghost. "I'm not asking you to come. I'm asking you not to fight me. There's a difference." He did not promise to stop fighting her, but he stopped, more or less, after that. The calls grew shorter and farther apart, and Eleanor told herself that this was as much peace as she was likely to get, and she packed what little she had into the back of her car, and on a cold, bright morning at the very end of February, she drove up the mountain to live in a house that 100 years of people had agreed was cursed. She did not go alone, in the end. That part she had not planned, and it turned out to be the part that saved her. Lily came 2 weeks after Eleanor moved in. Lily was 16, the daughter of Eleanor's own daughter Susan, who had died when Lily was 11, in a car on a wet road, in the kind of ordinary accident that takes the bottom out of a family without warning. After Susan, Lily had gone to live with her father, who had grieved as best he could, and then, the way the living do, had found someone new and built a different life with a different family in it. And Lily had grown up at the edge of that life, loved well enough, but never quite at the center, the child of the wife who came before. The one fixed point in all of it had been her grandmother. Eleanor had driven the long miles to Lily's school plays and her bad birthdays. Eleanor had been on the other end of the phone the nights the new family felt like a house Lily was only visiting. And when Lily, who was bright and stubborn and lonely in the particular way of teenagers who have learned not to expect too much, heard that her grandmother had moved alone into an enormous falling-down mansion 2 hours north, she did not think it was sad or frightening or foolish. She thought it was the most interesting thing she had ever heard, and she asked her father if she could spend the spring break with her grandmother, and her father, who was relieved more often than he liked to admit when Lily had somewhere else to be, said yes. So it was that Eleanor Caldwell, who had expected to grow old alone in a house full of dust, found herself instead sharing it with a 16-year-old girl who had her dead daughter's chin and her dead daughter's way of going quiet when she was thinking hard, and the house, which had been heavy with silence, began to fill with the sound of 2 people living in it. They set up in the 2 rooms that were soundest, the old housekeeper's quarters off the kitchen, where the roof was whole and the chimney drew and a person could keep warm. They cleaned what could be cleaned. They learned the house's moods, which doors stuck and which floors complained, and where the cold came in. Living in the house was hard in ways Eleanor had known it would be and in ways she had not. There was no heat anywhere but the kitchen, where the old range still drew, and on the coldest nights the 2 of them slept in their coats with every blanket they owned piled on top, and woke to their breath hanging white in the lamplight. Water had to be carried. The nearest working tap was an outdoor spigot that Hollis had kept alive for Edmund all those years, and Eleanor and Lily hauled it in by the bucket and heated it on the range, and learned to be careful with every drop. There was no telephone signal on the ridge unless you walked out past the gate and stood on the one bare rock where, for reasons no one understood, 2 bars would sometimes appear. There were nights the wind got into the broken parts of the house and moved through the empty upper rooms with a sound that raised the hair on Eleanor's neck, and she would lie awake listening and remind herself that wind was only wind. And yet, And yet there was something in those hard days that Eleanor had not felt in 3 long years of watching Walter die, or in the 8 gray months of sitting alone afterward. She was needed. The house needed her, plainly and constantly, the way a sick thing needs tending. And she rose every morning with a list of work in her head, and went to bed every night having done some of it. And she found, to her own surprise, that a person can be cold and tired and frightened and still, underneath all of it, be more alive than she has been in years. And in the evenings, by the light of the oil lamp from the library desk, which Eleanor had cleaned and filled, and which threw a soft gold circle over the kitchen table, they talked about the list. Eleanor had shown Lily the list on the second night. She had not meant to keep it from her, exactly, but she had been uncertain how much of the strange weight of it she could explain to a child, and she had not wanted to frighten her, or, worse, to fill her head with a treasure hunt that came to nothing and left her grandmother looking like a foolish old woman chasing a dead man's riddle. But Lily had found Eleanor reading the page one night and had asked what it was, and Eleanor had handed it to her, and Lily had read it through twice in silence, the way Eleanor herself had, and then she had looked up with her eyes bright in the lamplight and said the thing that decided it. "Grandma," she said, "he wrote this for somebody. Look, for my heir. He's talking to a person. He left this on his desk on purpose, where the next person who lived here would find it. This isn't crazy. This is a man telling somebody where something is, in a way only the right somebody could read." She turned the page toward the lamp. "What's the second face? What's the third stone? We have to find out. Grandma, we have to." And so they began, the old woman and the girl, to take the dead man's riddle apart line by line. The first line they solved was the one Eleanor had already half solved by herself, on that first afternoon, without knowing it. The east light at 4. For 3 days they argued about what it meant, until on the fourth afternoon Eleanor remembered the way the low sun had crossed the library paneling at 4:15 and made the grain of the wood stand up strange, and she took Lily into the library, and they waited. They sat on the dust sheets in the cold, tall room and watched the light move, and at 4 o'clock, almost exactly, the sun dropped behind the western trees and sent its last flat gold beams in through the high windows and across the floor and up the eastern wall, and there, where the raking light caught it, a seam appeared in the paneling that no eye could have found in the flat light of midday. A line, faint and straight, running down the join between two panels and then turning, a rectangle the height of a door and half its width, invisible at noon, written plainly by the sun at 4. Lily was on her feet before Eleanor could stop her, her hands flat against the panel, pressing, searching. "There's no handle," she said. "There's nothing. How do you? Grandma, how do you open it?" It was Eleanor, sitting still and watching, who saw it. "The light's already gone past," she said. "Look, the seam's fading. He didn't make it open with a handle. He made it so you could only even see it for a few minutes a day, and only if you knew to look. Wait, watch. Where the light is now. Watch what it's touching." The beam, sinking, had moved up the panel to a knot in the wood near the top, an ordinary-looking flaw, the kind no one would ever look at twice. But in the dying light Eleanor saw that the knot was a little too round, a little too regular, and she rose and crossed the room, and put her old thumb against it and pressed, and somewhere behind the wall a mechanism that had not moved in years gave a dry, reluctant click, and the panel swung in a finger's width on a hinge gone stiff with age. They got it open together, the two of them, pulling. Behind it was not the vault. Eleanor had not let herself believe it would be the vault, and it was not. Behind the panel was a shallow cabinet built into the thickness of the wall, lined with cedar, dry as a bone after all the years, and in it were two things. The first was a book, a thick book bound in dark leather, its spine uncracked, its pages dense with the same small, precise hand that had written the list. The second was a key. It was a key of black iron, heavy, longer than Eleanor's hand, the kind of key that does not open a drawer or a door in a house where people live, the kind of key that is made for one lock and one lock only. And Eleanor knew the moment she lifted it, by its weight and its age and the cold of it, that she was holding the key to the iron door in the deep of the house, the door with no handle, the door behind which the house had decided to hide whatever it was hiding. She did not go and try it. She had promised Hollis. And besides, she understood now, holding the key in one hand and the book in the other, that the book came first. A man did not leave a journal beside the key to his secret unless the journal was meant to be read before the key was turned. So they took the book back to the kitchen, and they set the lamp close, and Eleanor opened it to the first page, and she and Lily began to read the story that Edmund Caldwell had spent the last years of his life setting down for an heir he would never meet. The journal did not begin with Edmund. It began, in the patient way of a man who wanted his reader to understand everything, with the founder, Josiah Caldwell, who had built Aldercroft House more than 150 years ago, in the days when these hills were the edge of the known country and a man with nerve and no scruples could make himself a fortune out of iron and timber and the railroads that were just then reaching for the coast. Josiah had made such a fortune, and a large one, and according to the journal, he had made it in ways that did not bear close looking at, the way most of the great fortunes of that age were made, with a hand that took more than it gave and a memory that learned to forget the men it had ruined along the way. He had built Aldercroft as a monument to himself, the grandest house for 50 miles, set high on the ridge where every soul in the valley would have to look up at it. And then, being a clever and a fearful man, he had done a thing that the rest of his family would spend 100 years failing to understand. He had not trusted his fortune to banks, or to his sons, or to the future. Josiah had lived through panics and crashes and the sudden ruin of richer men than himself, and he had watched paper wealth turn to nothing in a season, and he had no faith at all in the world's promises. So he had taken the larger part of everything he had, and he had turned it, quietly, over many years, into the only things he believed would still be worth something when the paper burned. Gold. He had bought gold, and more gold, in quantities that would have alarmed his bankers had they known the whole of it, and he had brought it up the mountain in the night, a little at a time, in the bottoms of supply wagons, and he had hidden it in the one place no creditor, no son, no government, and no thief would ever think to dig. He had built a vault, not a strong room in the house, where anyone might find it, but a true vault, sunk deep below the foundations, into the living rock of the ridge, in a chamber that did not appear on any plan of the house, because Josiah had paid the men who dug it to dig it in secret, and had, the journal said, taken care that those men were sent far away with full pockets and closed mouths when the work was done. Below the level the water knows, the journal said, in a line Eleanor recognized with a jolt from the list. The vault lay below the natural water table of the ridge, in a place that wanted to flood, that would have flooded long ago and drowned everything in it, except that Josiah had also built, with the same secret labor, a system of drains and channels, and a great sloped floor that carried the water away and kept the deep chamber dry, so long as the system was tended, so long as someone kept the drains clear and the water moving. The moment the tending stopped, the journal warned, in a hand that pressed harder on the page, the water would come back, and the deep would fill, and everything Josiah had hidden would be lost under black water in the dark. That was the founder's secret, and it was also the founder's curse, though not the kind the town meant. He had built a treasure that could only survive if every generation that came after him kept watch over it. He had bound his descendants to the house with chains they could not see, and he had told only his eldest son, who told only his, the secret passing down the narrow thread of the family like a single candle carried hand to hand through a long dark house. Each keeper sworn to tend the drains and guard the truth and pass it on, and to tell no one outside the line, because a secret known to many is a secret no longer. For a while it had worked. The journal traced it down the generations, the keepers of Aldercroft, each one living in the great house above the valley, each one going down in the night to clear the channels and watch the water, each one growing a little poorer as the family's open wealth dwindled, because Josiah's hidden gold could not be touched, could not be spent, could only be guarded, on pain of breaking faith with the dead and undoing the whole long work. And the family, not knowing why the old men of each generation were so strange, so fixed on the house, so unwilling to sell it and leave even as it ate them alive, had begun to fray. There had been quarrels. There had been a son who did not believe the story, who thought the old man's talk of a vault was the rambling of a failing mind, and who left the mountain in anger and never came back. There had been the fire, the journal said, and here Eleanor read more slowly, because the fire was one of the things the town remembered. The fire had not been an accident. A keeper near the end of the line, pressed by creditors and tempted past bearing, had let a cousin in on the secret, hoping the two of them together could find a way to take the gold and run. The cousin had grown greedy, and there had been a struggle, and a lamp had been knocked over in the east wing, and 2 people had died in the fire that followed, and the secret had nearly died with them. After that, the journal said, the keepers had learned a harder lesson, which was that the only safe number of people who could know the truth was 1. And the town, watching the great house burn and the strange old family quarrel and die away one by one, had begun to tell itself a story to explain what it could not understand. It called the house cursed. It said the Caldwells were doomed, that the place killed those who lived in it, that no good ever came to anyone who climbed that drive. And the keepers of Aldercroft, the journal said, with something that in another man might have been a grim smile, had not corrected them. They had let the curse grow. They had fed it, even in small ways, because they understood at last what Josiah had understood about gold and paper. A thing that frightens people is the best wall in the world around a thing you do not want found. The curse was not the enemy of the secret. The curse was its finest guardian. 100 years of dread had done what no fence and no lock could do. It had emptied the mountain of the curious. It had taught every dog and every child and every grown man in the valley to stop at the bottom of the drive and turn back. And so the gold had lain safe in the dark below the water, not in spite of the curse, but because of it. Edmund came into the story late and alone. He had been the last of them, the last thread of Josiah's line, and the secret had come to him from his own father on his father's deathbed, the whole weight of it handed to a young man in a few whispered minutes. The vault and the drains and the duty and the warning never to trust the grasping remnants of the family with any part of the truth. Edmund had been left a choice that was not a choice. He could break faith, take the gold, and be the one who finally undid 150 years of guarding, with 2 dead in a fire to remind him what the gold did to those who reached for it. Or he could do what every keeper before him had done. He could give his life to it. He could climb the mountain and pull the door shut behind him and become the strange old man on the ridge, tending the water in the dark, year after year, decade after decade, refusing the world at the gate so that the world would never learn what the gate was hiding. He had chosen to guard it, and he had guarded it for more than 40 years. But Edmund, the journal said, in its last pages, had seen something his fathers had not let themselves see. He had seen that the thread was about to end. He had no children. The family that remained, the cousins and their cousins, were exactly the grasping, quarreling, faithless sort that Josiah's secret had always feared, and Edmund would no more have handed them the truth than he would have handed a child a lit fuse. The chain of keepers, unbroken for 150 years, was going to break with him, because there was no one left he could trust to carry the candle on. For a long time, the journal admitted, he had thought the only honest thing left to do was to let it end the way Josiah's fearful heart had always dreaded. To die, and tell no one, and let the drains fail, and let the black water rise in the dark and take the whole hidden fortune back into the rock forever, so that at least no greedy hand would ever close on it. He had nearly done it. He had been ready to die with the secret and let the water have it. And then, the journal said, he had thought about the cards. There was one person in the whole world, Edmund had written, who had never once asked him for anything, who had never climbed the mountain to flatter him or pry into his business or remind him of family or angle for a place in his will. One person who had simply, every year, for 50 years, sent a card up the mountain with a few plain, kind words in it, into a silence that never answered, expecting nothing back. His nephew Walter, a man Edmund had met only a handful of times and had come, over half a century of unanswered Christmases, to think of as the one decent soul the dwindling family had managed to produce. Walter had wanted nothing, and a man who wants nothing, Edmund had written, is the only man you can trust with everything. So he had changed his mind about letting the water take it. He had decided, instead, to leave the house and all it held to Walter, and to leave behind not the open truth, which could be stolen or coerced out of a living man, but a path. A riddle only a patient and an attentive and an honest person could ever follow, written in the private language of the house, so that whoever came to claim Aldercroft would have to earn the secret the way every keeper had earned it, by caring enough to look, by being the kind of person who would actually live in the place and learn its moods and watch its light and listen to what it was telling them. If the wrong sort came, the grasping sort, they would see only a worthless ruin and a madman's scribbled list, and they would sign it away and go, and the secret would sleep on, and the water would take it in its own slow time, and no harm would be done. But if the right sort came, the patient and the faithful sort, the sort who sent cards into the dark for 50 years asking nothing, then the house itself would lead them down, step by step, to the door, and to the key, and to everything Josiah Caldwell had hidden against the burning of the world. Walter had died before he ever knew, and the path had passed, with the house, to Walter's widow, to a 73-year-old woman who had spent her whole life being a person other people did not need to take seriously, who had buried a husband and a daughter and was about to lose her home, and who had climbed the mountain not out of greed, but because she had nowhere else to go, and because she could not bring herself to let strangers decide the fate of a thing a dying man had chosen to give her. To exactly, in other words, the patient and attentive and honest and unwanting sort of person that Edmund Caldwell had spent his last years praying would come. Eleanor closed the journal very softly, as if a loud sound might wake the house, and she sat in the small gold circle of the lamp with her granddaughter beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved against the old stone, and somewhere far below them in the dark of the foundations, in a chamber sunk into the living rock below the level the water knew, 150 years of a family's hidden faith waited behind an iron door for the key that was lying now on the kitchen table between an old woman and a girl. "Grandma," Lily said at last, in a whisper, "it's real. It's down there. It's really down there." "We don't know that yet," Eleanor said, though her heart was going like a girl's. "A man can believe a thing his whole life and be wrong. We don't know what's behind that door until we see it with our own eyes." But she did not believe her own caution, and Lily did not believe it either, and they both sat looking at the black iron key in the lamplight as if it might at any moment speak. And Eleanor, sitting in the lamplight with the key between them, found that her eyes had filled and that the tears were not for the gold that might or might not be waiting in the dark. They were for Walter, because she understood now, in a way that took the breath out of her, that none of this had ever really been meant for her at all. Edmund had chosen Walter. The house, the secret, the path, the whole hidden fortune of 150 years, every bit of it had been left to the one man who had sent a card up the mountain every Christmas for 50 years and asked for nothing back. It was Walter's faithfulness that had reached forward out of his quiet, ordinary life and found Edmund in his loneliness and earned, without ever trying to earn anything, all of this. Walter would never know. Walter had died in a gray March hospital room, never dreaming that his small kindness to a forgotten uncle had been seen and weighed and answered. The answer had come too late for him and had fallen instead to her, his widow, the woman he had loved for 49 years, so that even now, 8 months in the ground, Walter Caldwell was somehow still taking care of her, reaching past his own death to put a roof over her head and a key in her hand. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and let the tears come, and Lily, not understanding all of it, but understanding enough, leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder and said nothing, and the lamp burned between them in the dark. The next morning the world that did not believe came knocking, as if it had felt, somehow, that something on the mountain had shifted. It was Royce. He came up the drive in a new truck with the name of his sign business on the door, and he had another man with him, a younger man in a suit that did not fit the mountain at all, and Eleanor knew before either of them had said a word that the suit was a lawyer. She met them in the forecourt, because she did not want them in the house, and she stood with her aching hands folded in front of her and let Royce say his piece. He was sorry to trouble her, he said, in a voice that worked hard at being warm. He hoped she was settling in all right, though he had to say, looking around at the state of the place, he was worried about her. They were all worried about her. Family was family after all. And then he came to it. He had been talking to some folks. He had been thinking about Uncle Edmund's will, and the more he thought about it, the more it didn't sit right. A man that old, that far gone, living alone up here for 40 years, signing everything over in a will he made decades back and never looked at again. It raised questions, Royce said. Questions about whether the old man had been in his right mind. Questions a court might want to look at. He didn't want it to come to that, of course. Nobody wanted a fight. But he thought, in fairness to the whole family, that maybe the kindest thing, the simplest thing, would be for Eleanor to agree to sell the property now, while it was still worth the land it sat on, and divide the proceeds fairly among Edmund's blood, before lawyers and courts ate up whatever little the place was worth. He was sure she understood. It really wasn't hers, not in the way that counted. She'd married in. She'd had no idea the old man even existed until the letter came. Eleanor listened to all of it without moving, the way she had listened to him on the telephone, the way she had listened to the whole chorus of them since the letter came. And when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're right that I married in, Royce. And you're right that I hardly knew him. So tell me something. When did you last send Edmund Caldwell a Christmas card?" Royce blinked. "What? A card? A letter? Anything? In 40 years, did you ever once come up this mountain to see that old man, or write him a line, or do a single thing for him that didn't have your own pocket at the end of it?" The lawyer started to say something about how that wasn't really the legal question, and Eleanor turned her eyes on him, just for a moment, and he stopped. "I didn't think so," she said, turning back to Royce. "Because I have read everything that man left behind, Royce. Everything. And there is not one card from you in any of it. Not one letter. Not one visit. He died up here alone for 40 years, and the whole great family of his blood couldn't be troubled to climb the hill. And now that there's a will with my name on it, here you come in a new truck with a lawyer, talking about what's fair. You go on home. You bring your court, if you want to bring it. The will is the will, and it'll stand, because there was never anything wrong with that old man's mind. He knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly who he was leaving it to, and exactly who he wasn't. Now I'd like you to get off my mountain. I have work to do." She had never in her life spoken to anyone like that. She felt the strangeness of it in her own chest, the way the words came out steady when her hands were shaking, and she saw it land on Royce, the flush coming up in his neck, the easy warmth curdling into something uglier. He said some things then that she did not bother to remember, about how she'd regret it, about how she had no idea what she was taking on, about how a court would see right through a lonely old woman grasping at a dead man's house. Then he and the lawyer got back in the new truck and drove down the mountain, and Eleanor stood in the forecourt until the sound of the engine was gone, and then she let herself sit down, rather suddenly, on the cold stone of the front step, because her legs had decided all at once that they had had enough. Lily came and sat down beside her and put an arm around her, and they sat together in the gray morning in front of the great dark house. "You were amazing," Lily said. "I was rude. You were amazing." Eleanor laughed, shakily, and wiped her eyes with the back of one aching hand. The threat was real, she knew. Royce would bring his lawyers, and even if the will stood in the end, the fight could drag on for a year, 2 years, and lawyers cost money she did not have, and the back taxes were still owed, and the medical debt was still owed, and the whole fragile structure of her staying here was built on nothing but a dead man's faith and a riddle they had not yet finished reading. If there was nothing behind the iron door, if Edmund had been wrong or mad, or if the water had already come, then Royce would win in the end simply by waiting, and she would lose the house and her home and the last shred of the dignity she had found on this mountain, and she would go, at 73, into one of David's safe small rooms, having chased a ghost up a hill for nothing. There was only one way to know. "We have to go down," she said. "Today. I have to know what's behind that door before that man comes back with anything else." She got to her feet, slowly, holding the doorframe. "Go find Hollis. Tell him it's time. Tell him I'm not going down there without him, like I promised, but that I am going down there. Today." Hollis came within the hour, and Eleanor saw that Lily had told him, because his broad, weathered face had a look on it she had not seen before, a kind of bracing, the look of a man walking toward the one thing he had spent 20 years walking around. He stood in the great hall with the iron key in his hand, turning it over, and he was quiet for a long moment. 40 years I left his supplies at that gate," he said. "And I always knew. Some part of me always knew there was something in this house. The way he watched you. The way he never let a soul pass the door. You don't act like that over nothing." He closed his hand around the key. "All right. Let's go find out what an old man was guarding with his life. But we go careful. We go slow. And the first sign that floor isn't sound, or that air isn't good, we come back up. Agreed?" "Agreed," Eleanor said. They found the way down in the cellar, where the journal had told them to look, and where the list, which they had carried folded in Eleanor's pocket, gave up its last secrets one by one. The cellar of Aldercroft was a low stone vault under the kitchen wing, dank and cold, with a packed earth floor and walls of rough fieldstone. And at first it looked like nothing but a cellar, the ordinary underbelly of an old house. But the journal had said the deep was reached from here, and the list had said the third stone, and so they searched, the three of them, Hollis's big hands and Lily's quick ones and Eleanor's patient eyes, until Eleanor found, low in the western wall, half hidden behind the rotted remains of a wine rack, a course of larger stones set into the fieldstone, and she counted along it, 1, 2, 3, and the third stone. When Hollis pressed his shoulder to it at Eleanor's word, did not press like a stone set in mortar. It moved. It swung inward on a pivot ground into the rock below, slow and grinding, 150 years of stillness giving way, and behind it was a black opening, and a flight of steps going down into the dark, narrow and steep, cut from the living rock of the ridge. Cold air came up out of the opening, and with it the smell of stone and deep water and time, and the three of them stood at the top of the stair and shone the flashlight down into a darkness that swallowed the beam long before it reached the bottom. Below the level the water knows, Eleanor said softly, reading the line off the page one last time, and she understood now exactly what it meant, and why an old man had given his life to a system of drains, and what waited at the bottom of these steps if Josiah's hidden engineering had held, and what waited there if it had not. They went down. The stair was long, longer than Eleanor had braced for, the steps shallow and even, worn smooth by the feet of 150 years of keepers going down in the dark to tend the water. The walls pressed close on either side, the bare rock damp and cold under her trailing hand. Hollis went first with the light, testing each step, and Lily came behind him, and Eleanor came last, holding the rail that some long-dead Caldwell had bolted into the rock for exactly this descent. Eleanor thought, as she went down into the rock one careful step at a time, of all the others who had made this descent before her. 150 years of them. Josiah first, in the beginning, standing where she stood now and watching his secret men cut these very steps. Then his son, and his son's son, the long line of keepers, each of them coming down here in the dark with a lamp in one hand, year after year, decade after decade, to clear the channels and watch the water and keep faith with a dead man's fear. Edmund last of all, an old man with aching joints not so different from her own, descending these steps alone every season for 40 years to do the work that kept the deep dry, knowing there was no one to come after him, knowing the candle was guttering, and doing it anyway. She had never met any of them but Edmund, and him only twice, and yet going down their stair in the cold she felt them around her, the long patient company of the keepers, and she understood that she was not, after all, the first woman to be bound to this house by something she had not asked for. She was only the latest, and she was, if the journal was right, the last, and what she found at the bottom of these steps would decide whether the whole long faith of them had been worth a single thing, or whether it ended here, with her, in black water and the dark. The air grew colder as they went down, and damper, and somewhere ahead and below them now Eleanor could hear it, the thing the whole story had been circling. Water. The sound of running water, steady and patient and dark, moving through channels in the rock. The water the keepers had fought for 150 years, still flowing, still being carried away down its built channels, kept off the deep by drains that an old man had cleared with his own hands until the year he died. The stair ended at last in a low chamber, and Hollis swept the light around it, and they saw what the founder had built. The floor of the chamber was sloped, gently, all of it canting toward narrow channels cut along its edges, and in those channels the dark water ran, gathered from the weeping rock all around, and carried away into the deeper dark, drained off and away, so that the center of the chamber, the floor where they stood, was damp but not flooded, kept just barely dry by the long patient logic of Josiah's engineering. The level the water knew was here, all around them, held back by inches, held off by nothing but a system that one death, one failed winter, one unguarded year would have undone. And across the chamber, set into the far wall of living rock, black and enormous and exactly as Eleanor had known it would be, was a face. No, faces. A row of them, carved into the rock above a low stone ledge, weathered and strange in the flashlight's beam. The faces of men long dead, family faces perhaps, or the faces of gods, or simply the faces of frightened, clever man, had set there to guard his deepest secret. Eleanor counted them, and her heart climbed into her throat, because she knew the line by heart now. She had read it 100 times. Behind the second face. There, she said, and her voice shook, and she did not try to stop it. The second one. Hollis. Behind the second face. Hollis crossed the damp, sloped floor with the light, and Eleanor and Lily came close behind, and he reached up to the second carved face in the row, the worn stone visage staring out of the rock with its blind eyes, and he pressed his thumbs into the hollows of its eyes where the journal had said to press. And for a moment nothing happened, and Eleanor's whole life seemed to hang in the cold, in the dark, and the sound of the running water. Then, behind the rock, something ancient turned. A grinding, a deep stone shudder that they felt in the soles of their feet, and a section of the wall beside the carved faces, a section they had taken for solid rock, swung back on a hidden pivot, slow and ponderous and enormous, revealing behind it a short passage, and at the end of that passage, in the trembling beam of the flashlight, a door. The iron door. The same plate iron, the same row of heavy bolts gone orange with rust, the same single keyhole and no handle. Reached now not from the corridors above, but from below, from the deep, from the bottom of everything, exactly where 150 years of a family's faith had said it would be. The door behind which Josiah Caldwell had hidden the only things he believed would still be worth anything when the paper of the world burned away. The door an old man had given his whole life to guarding. The door the key in Eleanor's hand was made, and had only ever been made, to open. Eleanor walked the last few steps down the passage with the water running in the dark behind her and her granddaughter's hand gripping her arm and Hollis's light steady on the lock, and she lifted the great black iron key, and her hand, for once, did not shake at all. She fit the key to the lock. It slid home with the heavy certainty of a thing meeting the one place in all the world it was made for. And she took a breath, the deepest breath she had taken in 8 long gray months, and she turned it. The lock was stiff with 150 years of stillness, and for one terrible moment Eleanor thought it would not turn at all, that the key would break off in her hand and leave them standing in the dark with the water running behind them and the answer sealed away forever. She put both hands to it. Hollis put his great hand over both of hers, and together, slowly, with a groan of old iron surrendering, the key turned, and somewhere inside the door the heavy bolts drew back with a sound like something waking after a long sleep, and the iron door swung inward on its hinges, and the beam of the flashlight went past it into the chamber beyond. For a moment none of them could speak, or move, or even breathe. The light found the far wall, and the near wall, and the floor, and what lay upon the floor, and the three of them stood at the threshold of the deep with the cold air of the chamber breathing out around them, and Eleanor heard, very far away, the small sound of her granddaughter beginning to cry. The chamber was not large. That was the first surprise, that a thing the whole story had been climbing toward should be a room a person could cross in a dozen steps, low-ceilinged, cut from the living rock, dry as old bone after 150 years because an old man and his fathers before him had kept it so. But it was not empty. Along the walls, stacked on stone shelves and in low wooden racks gone gray with age, were rows upon rows of small bars, dark in the dust, but catching the light where the dust had not settled, throwing back a deep, dull yellow gleam that no other metal in the world has ever thrown. Gold. Bar upon bar of it, stacked with the same care Edmund had given to the plates in the dining room and the books in the library. A fortune in the oldest and surest form a fearful man had ever found to keep his wealth, brought up the mountain in the bottoms of wagons in the dead of night, more than a century before any of them were born, and lying here in the dark below the water ever since, waiting. Eleanor took one step into the chamber, and then another, and she reached out and laid her old aching hand flat against the stacked bars, and the cold of the gold came up through her palm, and she knew, the way you know a thing in the body before the mind can hold it, that it was real, that the whole story was real, that an old man she had met twice had told the truth, and that his fathers had told the truth, and that Josiah Caldwell, dead 150 years, had told the truth most of all. The paper of the world had burned again and again, panics and crashes and wars, and the slow ruin of every certain thing. And through all of it, the gold had lain here in the dark, unmoved, untouched, worth exactly what it had always been worth, which was everything. Behind her, Hollis had not moved. The man who had left an old recluse's supplies at the gate for 20 years, who had wondered all that time what kind of thing made a person shut himself away, stood in the doorway of the deep with the flashlight steady in his hand and his mouth open, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing in him that had words for it. Lily had sunk down onto the bottom step of the rock stair with her hands over her mouth, looking at the stacked gold and the sealed cases and the low racks running back into the dark, and the only sound in the chamber was the small high catch of her breathing and, far off, the patient running of the water in its channels. Eleanor turned slowly, taking it in. She had spent a long life learning not to want things, because wanting things you could not have was a way to make a hard life harder. And so the strange truth was that, standing in a room with more wealth in it than she could count, what she felt was not desire. It was awe, and under the awe something close to grief, because she was thinking of the man who had sat down here alone in this exact spot, year after year, in the cold and the dark, guarding all of this so that no greedy hand would ever close on it, and dying at last up in his library with the whole of it still hidden beneath him, having spent it on nothing, having kept it perfectly, having given his one life to the keeping. It was the loneliest thing she had ever stood inside, and it was, she understood, the most faithful. But the gold was not all of it. That was the thing that none of them had expected, not even Eleanor, who had read the journal twice and thought she understood. The journal had told the founder's story, the story of gold hidden against the burning of the world. It had not told the rest, because the rest had come after Josiah, added by the keepers who followed him, each one bringing down into the deep the things their own age believed would outlast it. And so, as Hollis swept the light slowly around the chamber, the deeper wealth of Aldercroft revealed itself piece by piece, 150 years of a family's hidden faith laid out in the dark. There were flat wooden cases stacked against one wall, sealed and waxed, and when Hollis eased one open with his pocket knife, the light fell on a painting, a small dark canvas of a room with a window and a woman reading a letter, the colors as deep and as living as the day they were laid down, kept from the light and the damp for so long that it might have been finished that morning. And behind it another, and another, a whole collection of them, paintings that a Caldwell somewhere down the line, a collector in a richer generation, had bought and brought up the mountain and hidden away in the only place he trusted, where no fire and no creditor and no thief would ever find them. Old paintings, the kind of paintings that hang behind glass with a guard standing near them, the kind no one in the valley below had ever dreamed were sitting in the dark under the cursed house on the ridge. There were small heavy chests that held coins, not the gold bars but coins, thousands of them, sorted and sleeved, the kind of coins that collectors cross oceans for, struck in mints that had closed before Eleanor's grandmother was born. There were leather folios of papers, certificates and bonds and instruments in the careful copperplate of another century, some of them worthless now and some of them, it would turn out, very far from worthless. There were boxes of jewelry, old settings, stones that threw back the flashlight in hard bright colors, the small portable wealth of a family that had learned across generations to keep nothing it could not carry out in the night. And in the center of it all, on a low stone table, there was a single wooden box, plain and unsealed, and Eleanor crossed to it and lifted the lid, and inside, on a bed of faded cloth, lay a stack of envelopes, tied with string, 50 of them, more, and she did not need to open them to know what they were. They were the cards. Every card Walter had ever sent. 50 years of Christmas cards into the dark, kept by a lonely old man, here, in the deepest and safest place he had, beside the gold and the paintings and everything Josiah Caldwell had hidden against the end of the world. Edmund had kept them all. Of everything in that chamber, of everything 150 years of keepers had thought worth hiding in the deep, the thing the last of them had set in the very center, in a box he did not even bother to seal, was the only kindness anyone had ever shown him. Eleanor sat down, rather suddenly, on the cold stone floor of the chamber, with the box of cards in her lap, and she wept. Not for the gold. The gold she could not yet feel, The gold was too large and too strange to feel. She wept for Walter, who had sent these into the silence year after year, never knowing they were caught, and held, and treasured. She wept for Edmund, who had sat down here alone in the dark with a stranger's kindness and given his whole life to guarding a fortune he could never spend and a faith no one had asked him to keep. And she wept, a little, for herself, for the long gray months and the unopened envelopes and the corner she had been backed into, and for the way the whole impossible thing had turned, at the last, on nothing grander than an old man remembering that somebody, once, had remembered him. Lily knelt down beside her and put her arms around her, and Hollis stood over the two of them with the light, his weathered face wet in the glow of it. The man who had not crossed the threshold of the house in 20 years standing now in the deepest room of it with an old woman and a girl, and after a while he said, in a voice rough with something he did not have words for, well, he wasn't mad, was he? He was the sanest man on this mountain, and the loneliest, and nobody ever knew. We know now, Eleanor said. We know now, Hollis. And that's something. That's not nothing. They did not take anything out of the chamber that day. Eleanor would not let them, and Hollis would not have let them either, and Lily, when it was explained to her, understood. There was a fortune in that room, a fortune past any of their imagining, and a fortune is the most dangerous thing in the world to a person who has nothing, because the world is full of hands that will close on it the moment they learn it is there. Eleanor had read the journal. She had read what the gold did to the keepers who reached for it, the fire, the two dead, the cousin who turned greedy in the dark. She had seen, that very morning, what the mere rumor of money had brought up the mountain in a new truck with a lawyer in it. And she understood, sitting on the cold floor of the deep with everything she had ever needed stacked around her in the dark, that the chamber had not solved her problems. It had only changed them. She was no longer a poor widow about to lose her home. She was now an old woman alone on a mountain with the better part of $500 million sitting under her house, and a grasping family already circling, and not the first idea in the world how to keep any of it. So they closed the door. They drew the great iron door shut, and Eleanor turned the key and felt the bolts go home, and they climbed back up out of the deep, up the long stair worn smooth by 150 years of keepers, and they swung the pivot stone shut behind them, and they came up into the gray afternoon light of the cellar, and then the kitchen, blinking, changed, carrying a secret heavier than any of them had carried in their lives. And that night, by the lamp, Eleanor did the thing that the keepers before her had never been able to do, the thing that had broken faith and started fires every time it was tried across 150 years. She decided to tell. Not the family, not the town, not anyone whose hand might close. But she could not do this alone, an old woman of 73 with aching hands and no idea how the world of such things worked, and she knew it. And she had spent a long life learning the difference between the people you could trust and the people you could not. There was one person in all of this who had handled the dead man's affairs with care and patience and had not once tried to talk her into anything that served himself. The young solicitor, Pruitt. She drove down the mountain the next morning, out past the gate to the one bare rock where the two bars sometimes appeared, and she called him, and she told him she needed to see him, in person, alone, on a matter of some importance, and that she would prefer he say nothing to anyone about the meeting. And then she drove the 2 hours north to the small town where his office was, and she sat across his desk from him, and she told him everything. He did not believe her at first. She had not expected him to. She watched the careful professional patience on his young face as he prepared, gently, to explain to a grieving old woman that she had perhaps been spending too much time alone in a frightening house and had let her imagination run away with her. And then she set on his desk 3 things she had carried down the mountain in her purse. The journal, the black iron key, and 1 gold bar, a single one, the only thing she had taken from the chamber, heavy and dull and unmistakable, sitting in the middle of a small-town lawyer's desk between his coffee cup and his telephone like a thing fallen out of a dream. Pruitt looked at it for a long time. He picked it up. He felt the weight of it and the cold of it, and something changed in his face, the professional patience falling away and underneath it a young man's plain astonishment, and he said, very quietly, "Mrs. Caldwell, is there more of this?" "There is a room of it," Eleanor said, "and a great deal besides. And I am an old woman who does not know the first thing about any of it. and I need someone honest to help me do this right, before the wrong people find out it exists. Are you that someone, Mr. Pruitt? Because if you are not, tell me now, and I will find someone else, and you will forget this conversation ever happened." Pruitt set the gold bar down very carefully, as if it might break, or as if he might. "I am," he said. "I am that someone. We are going to do this exactly right, Mrs. Caldwell, every step of it, by the book, with the proper people and the proper protections, so that what is yours stays yours and no one can ever take it from you. But I am going to be honest with you in return, because you have been honest with me. A thing this size does not stay quiet for long. The moment we bring in appraisers, authorities, the people who have to be brought in to do this properly, word will begin to move. Your family will hear. The world will hear. You should prepare yourself. Your life is about to change, and not all of the change will be the kind you want." "My life has already changed, Mr. Pruitt," Eleanor said. "It changed the day I opened that letter. I have buried a husband and a daughter, and very nearly my own future. I am not afraid of change. I am only afraid of doing this wrong, and of letting that old man's 150 years come to nothing in the end because I trusted the wrong people. So let's do it right." What followed took months, and it took an army of careful people, and Eleanor lived through all of it with a steadiness that surprised everyone but Lily and Hollis, who had seen, by then, what the old woman was made of. Pruitt brought in the right people, and the right people brought in others, and Aldercroft, which for 150 years had been a place no one would climb to, became, very quietly, a place that careful men and women in good shoes came up the mountain to see. It was the strangest season of Eleanor's life, and in some ways the hardest, harder than the cold nights and the carried water, because there is a particular loneliness in being suddenly surrounded by people who have come for the thing you are sitting on rather than for you. The mountain that no soul had climbed in 40 years was suddenly never empty. There were guards now, quiet men in dark coats that Pruitt had arranged, posted at the gate and at the cellar stair, because a fortune the world has begun to whisper about is a fortune that draws every kind of attention, and not all of it lawful. There were unmarked trucks coming up the drive in the early mornings. There were people Eleanor had never met walking through the rooms she and Lily had cleaned by hand, measuring, photographing, murmuring to one another in the careful low voices of people who handle valuable things for a living. She gave them coffee. She did not know what else to do, so she gave them coffee, and she watched, and she learned. She remembered one afternoon in particular, when the painting people, the ones from the auction house in the city, had lifted the small dark canvas of the woman reading the letter out of its case under the good lamps they had brought, and a young woman among them, a specialist who could not have been 30, had taken one look at it and had to sit down, and had started, very quietly, to cry, the way a person cries at the sight of something they had only ever read about and never thought to see, with their own eyes. Eleanor had brought her a cup of coffee and sat with her, and the young woman had said, wiping her face, that there were perhaps a handful of people alive who would understand what it meant that this had been sitting in the dark under a mountain for 100 years, and that she was sorry. She was being unprofessional. It was only that she had spent her whole life studying things like this and had never once expected to stand in a room with one. And Eleanor had patted her hand and said that she understood completely, that she had felt much the same the first time she came up the drive and saw the house, and that there was no shame in being undone by a beautiful thing the whole world had agreed to walk past. There were appraisers who handled the gold, weighing and assaying it under guard, who told her at last what the bullion alone was worth, and the number, when it came, was a little over $200 million. There were specialists from an auction house in the city, men and women who put on white gloves to lift the paintings from their cases, and who went very still and very quiet when they saw what was in them, and who came to Eleanor after weeks of study and told her, in voices that shook a little, that the collection of paintings hidden in the deep of her house was worth, by their best and most careful estimate, something more than $220 million on its own, and that several of the works were of a quality that museums would compete for the right to hang. There were the coin people, the numismatists, who valued the collection of struck coins at $35 million. There were the document specialists, who sorted the worthless old certificates from the ones that, astonishingly, still held value, securities and instruments that a careful firm had honored down the generations, and who put the value of the papers and the historical documents at $20 million more. And there were the jewelers, who valued the old settings and the hard bright stones at another 20 million. When it was all done, when every gloved expert had finished and every figure had been checked and checked again, Pruitt sat across from Eleanor at the long table in the great hall of Aldercroft, the hall where a girl had fallen 100 years before, the hall she and Lily had cleaned with their own hands, and he laid a single sheet of paper in front of her with one number written at the bottom of it. The whole of it, everything Josiah Caldwell had hidden against the burning of the world, and everything the keepers who came after him had added to it, valued at last in the cold daylight of the present age. $495 million. Eleanor looked at the number for a long time. Then she set the paper down and looked out through the tall front windows of the hall, down the long drive and the mountain and the valley, to where the lights of Ledford were just beginning to come on in the dusk, the small dying town that had told itself for 100 years that there was nothing up here worth the climb. $495 million, she said, very quietly, mostly to herself. And for 50 years, the richest man for 100 miles couldn't get a single soul to come up this hill and sit with him at Christmas. It was Royce, in the end, who forced the vindication out into the open, though he had not meant to, and though it did not go at all the way he had planned. He had filed his challenge to the will not long after his visit, as he had threatened, the suit alleging that Edmund Caldwell had not been of sound mind when he made his testament, that the bequest to a distant nephew's widow was the product of a confused and failing old man, and that the estate ought by rights to be divided among Edmund's blood. He had filed it believing the estate was a worthless ruin and a money pit, believing the fight was about little more than the land the house sat on and the satisfaction of not letting an outsider have it. He had filed it, in other words, as a small spiteful thing, expecting a small spiteful resolution. And then the news of what was in the house began to move, the way Pruitt had warned her it would, and Royce's small spiteful suit became, overnight, a fight over $500 million, and the whole scattered grasping remnant of the Caldwell family came down on the mountain like crows on a field. Cousins Eleanor had never met called her, and then their lawyers called Pruitt, and the suit that Royce had filed alone swelled with names, all of them suddenly certain that they had always loved Uncle Edmund, that they had always meant to visit, that the fortune was theirs by blood, and that the widow had no claim to a single bar of it. It collapsed. It collapsed completely, and it collapsed for the simplest reason in the world, which was that Edmund Caldwell had left, in the deep of his house, the single most overwhelming proof of a sound and deliberate mind that any court in the country had ever been shown. A confused old man does not maintain a system of drains and channels for 40 years to keep a hidden chamber dry. A failing mind does not compose a journal of 150 years of family history in a small precise hand, or design a riddle of clues in the private language of a house so that only a patient and attentive heir could follow it, or arrange the whole long, careful transfer of a secret fortune to the one member of a faithless family who had shown him kindness. Everything Royce had alleged, the journal disproved. Everything the family claimed, the path itself refuted. Edmund had not been confused. Edmund had been, as Hollis had said in the dark of the chamber, perhaps the sanest man on the mountain, and he had left behind, without meaning to, the perfect defense of his own will. The court did not take long. The challenge was dismissed, the will upheld, and Eleanor Caldwell was confirmed, in the cold language of the law, as the rightful and sole owner of everything in the house and under it. She saw Royce one last time, after it was over, on the steps of the courthouse in the gray light of a winter morning. He was waiting for her, and his lawyer was not with him, and the easy warmth he had worked so hard at on her mountain was gone entirely. And what was left underneath, it was not the ugliness she had braced for. It was shame. He stood there in his good coat, a middle-aged man who had reached for something and been shown, in open court, exactly what he was, and he could not at first meet her eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. "For all of it. The lawyers. The things I said. I thought." He stopped. "I thought it was nothing up there. I thought you'd taken something that should have been ours. And I thought you were a foolish old woman grasping at a ruin. And the whole time." He shook his head. "He left it to Walter. Because Walter sent him cards. And not one of us ever did. Not one of us ever climbed that hill in 40 years. He looked at her then, finally. He knew exactly who we were. Didn't he? That's why he hid it the way he did. so that people like me would never find it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had imagined this moment more than once over the long months. In the dark nights when the unfairness of the whole grasping family had sat heavy on her chest, and in her imaginings she had said cutting things, true things, things he deserved. But standing in front of him now, an ordinary tired man who had been wrong and knew it, she found she did not want to say any of them. She was too old, and she had buried too many people, and she had learned somewhere along the way that there is no triumph in grinding down a person who is already on the ground. "Yes," she said, "he knew who you were, but he knew who Walter was, too. And the thing about that old man, Royce, the thing nobody on this whole mountain ever understood, is that he was not bitter. He could have let the water take all of it rather than give a penny to a family that forgot him. He nearly did. But in the end, he didn't reach for spite. He reached for the one good thing the family ever did, however small, and he gave everything to that. That's not a curse. That's about the least cursed thing I ever heard of." She drew her coat closer against the cold. "Go home, Royce. Send your children up the mountain sometime. The house is going to be open now, and there's coffee on, and your family, whatever else you are. That's the part you got wrong. It was never about keeping you out. It was about who bothered to come in." And she went down the courthouse steps and left him standing there. And she did not look back, and she did not feel, as she had once expected she would, any triumph at all. She felt only tired and clear and ready to go home and begin the rest of it. David flew out the week the news broke. He came up the mountain in a rental car, and Eleanor met him in the forecourt where she had met Royce, where she had stood and looked up at the great dark house on that first gray afternoon and felt it looking back. And her son got out of the car and stood there looking at the house, and then at his mother, and his face was doing something complicated. He had spent months telling her to sign it away. He had used the word safe 4 times in one phone call, and the word small underneath it more times than that. He had been, by every measure he had believed in, completely and certainly right, and he had been, it turned out, completely and certainly wrong, and he did not know how to hold both of those things at once. "Mom," he said. He stopped. "I told you to give it up. I told you it was nothing. I told you to let the county take it." "You did," Eleanor said. "I was trying to protect you. I know you were. I was wrong." "You were," she agreed. And then, because he looked so stricken, and because he was her son, and because she had not climbed this whole long mountain to stand at the top of it and be cruel to the people she loved, she crossed the forecourt and put her aching hand against his face the way she had when he was small. "You were wrong, David, and it's all right. You were wrong because you loved me and you were afraid for me, and that's the best kind of wrong there is. Royce was wrong because he was greedy. There's a world of difference, and I know it, and I've never once held it against you." She patted his cheek. "Now come inside. There's somebody I want you to really meet. Your niece has been holding this whole place together with me, and she's the bravest person on this mountain, and I have decided some things about the future that I want to tell you both at once." The things she had decided, she told them that evening, the 3 of them in Hollis around the long table in the great hall, by the light of the oil lamp from the library desk. She had thought about it for a long time, through all the cold nights and the long, careful months, and she knew her own mind. She was going to keep the house. That was the first thing, and the most important. She was not going to sell Aldercroft, not to anyone, not for anything. 150 years of keepers had given their lives to keep it standing, and an old man had given 40 years to keep it dry, and she was not going to let it pass into the hands of strangers who would gut it for the land or turn it into something it was never meant to be. She was going to do what no Caldwell had been able to do in over a century. She was going to save it. She had the means now, more means than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, and she was going to pour what it took into the old stone bones of the place and bring it back. The roof and the rotting wing and the rooms full of dust, all of it. Restore it not as a monument or a museum, but as a house, a living house, a place with people in it and lamps in the windows and coffee on. The thing Josiah Caldwell had built it to be before the fear got into the family and turned it into a tomb. And when she was gone, she said, and here she reached across the table and took Lily's hand, it would go to Lily. Not the money only, though there would be money, more than enough to give the girl any future she could dream of, college and beyond, a life with no locked doors in it. But the house too, the house most of all, because of everyone in the whole grasping, scattered family. of everyone who had circled and schemed and called her a foolish old woman, the only one who had come up the mountain and believed, the only one who had sat by the lamp and read the riddle and said we have to find out, the only one who had loved the strange dark house for itself before there was a single reason to, had been this girl. This 16-year-old with her dead mother's chin and her grandmother's stubbornness. Lily was the heir Edmund had been praying for, as much as Eleanor was. Lily would be the next keeper of Aldercroft, not a keeper of a secret in the dark, not a prisoner of a fortune in the deep, but a keeper of a home, a steward of a saved place, the first of a new line that tended the house out of love instead of fear. Lily could not speak. She sat with her grandmother's hand in hers and the tears running down her dead mother's chin, and she nodded, over and over, and that was answer enough. There was Hollis, too, and Eleanor had not forgotten him, and she did not insult him with charity. She made him an offer instead, plain and fair, the way you make an offer to a man you respect. For 20 years he had been the only soul on the mountain who had served that house and that old man faithfully, leaving the supplies at the gate, asking nothing, never once trying to get past the door to see what he could take. He had been, in his own quiet way, a keeper too. So Eleanor asked him to stay. To be the caretaker of Aldercroft, a real one now, not a man leaving tins at a gate, but the warden of a great house being brought back to life, with a real wage and a real home in the restored gatehouse and a real place in whatever the mountain was going to become. Hollis, who had crossed the threshold of that house for the first time in his life to walk down into the dark with her, looked at the floor for a while, the way he did, and then he said that he supposed somebody had to keep an eye on the place, and that it might as well be a fool who already knew its moods, and Eleanor understood that this was a yes, and that it was as much of one as Hollis was ever going to say out loud. And there was Ledford. Eleanor had thought about Ledford a great deal, the small dying town at the bottom of the mountain, the boarded windows and the peeling church and the hardware store where she had found Hollis sorting bolts. The town had spent 100 years keeping the secret of Aldercroft without ever knowing it, keeping it with its fear, its curse, its agreement that there was nothing up here worth the climb. The dread of the place had been the wall around the gold. In a way Eleanor could not fully explain even to herself. She felt the town was owed something for that, for the long, unwitting watch it had kept. So she began, quietly, through Pruitt, to give some of it back. Not handed out, not charity, but built. The restoration of the house alone would need workers, and Eleanor saw to it that the work went to Ledford, to the carpenters and masons and roofers of the valley, so that for the first time and longer than anyone could remember, there was good steady work on the mountain and money moving through the town. She bought the hardware store and kept it open and put Hollis's nephew behind the counter. She gave the school what it needed. She had the church painted. She did it without speeches and without her name on anything, because she had learned from an old man that the best things are often done in the dark by people who want nothing back, and the town, which did not entirely understand what was happening to it, began, slowly, to come back to life. The curse, people started to say, must finally have lifted. And in a way they were right, though it had never been a curse. Only 100 years of fear standing guard over a secret, and what lifted it was not magic. What lifted it was an old woman deciding to care for a place instead of being afraid of it. That was all a curse had ever been, on that mountain. The refusal to climb the hill and look. The first winter after the work began, Eleanor stood at the bottom of the drive one evening, where Hollis had first stopped his truck and pointed up the slope and asked her to tell him she felt nothing, and she looked up at the house. The scaffolding was down off the eastern wing by then, the collapsed and rebuilt stone by stone, the old stone kept where it could be saved and new stone cut to match where it could not, and the roof was whole, slate gray and sound against the winter sky, and for the first time and longer than anyone in the valley had been alive, there was light in the windows. Not one lamp. Every window. Eleanor had asked the workers, on the shortest night of the year, to leave the lights burning in every room they had finished, and they had. And the great house that had stood dark on the ridge for 100 years, the black shape that mothers used to point to and children used to dare each other toward, stood blazing from end to end against the dark mountain, every window gold and warm and alive, like a thing that had been holding its breath for a century and had finally let it go. Down in Ledford, people came out of their houses to look. Some of them had never seen the house lit in their lives. Some of them had spent their whole lives being afraid of it. And they stood in the cold street of their small, reviving town and looked up at the lights of Aldercroft burning on the ridge, and whatever they had believed about that mountain for 100 years, Eleanor was told later that more than one of them had wept to see it, without quite knowing why. The debts were the smallest thing, in the end, and the strangest. One afternoon, before the Great Restoration began, before the lawyers and the appraisers had even finished, Pruitt brought the papers up the mountain, and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and paid them. The back rent on the house on Pearl Street, the house she had been about to lose. The medical debt from Walter's long dying, the part the insurance had decided after he was gone that it would not cover. A little under $30,000, all told. The number with no bottom, the number that had backed her into the corner and driven her up the mountain in the first place, the number that had been, 8 months before, the whole impossible weight of her life. She wrote it out, or rather she signed where Pruitt showed her to sign, and it was gone, paid in an afternoon, less than the cost of a single one of the gold bars stacked in the dark below her feet. And Eleanor sat at the kitchen table afterward and looked at the cleared accounts and did not feel rich. She felt, instead, an ache so deep it surprised her, because she was thinking of Walter and of the 3 years they had spent watching that debt grow, the small economies, the things they had gone without, the nights he had lain awake worrying about the money when he should have been resting, dying, when the thing he should have been able to do with his last months was simply be at peace. The fortune could pay the debt. It could not give Walter back the peace the debt had stolen from his final year. Money, Eleanor was learning, was a strange and powerful thing, and there were wounds it could close in an afternoon, and there were others it could not touch at all, and wisdom was knowing which was which. She kept the cards. Of everything in that chamber, the gold and the paintings and the coins and the stones, the one thing Eleanor took out of the deep and brought up into the light and kept for herself was the wooden box of 50 Christmas cards. She set it on the mantel in the great hall, where the light came in through the tall windows, and on the worst days, the days when the grief for Walter rose up out of nowhere and took her by the throat the way it still did and always would, she would take the cards down and read them, his small kind plain words sent year after year into a silence that he never knew was listening. And she would think about how the smallest, quietest, most easily overlooked thing a person ever did, a card sent to a lonely old man asking nothing back, had reached across 50 years and 2 deaths and saved her life. She would think about how the whole world had looked at Edmund Caldwell and seen a madman, and looked at Aldercroft and seen a ruin, and looked at her, a poor old widow with aching hands, and seen nothing worth taking seriously at all, and how the whole world had been wrong about every single one of them. And she would put the cards back in their box on the mantel and go on with the work of the living, which never ends, and is the only thing that ever truly saves anyone. She went to see Edmund once, when the worst of the legal storm had passed and the house had begun to come back. He was buried in the small churchyard in Ledford, in the Caldwell plot, under a stone so plain and so weathered that she had to clear the moss from it with her own hand to read his name. Edmund Caldwell, and the dates, and nothing else. No word about the man, because there had been no one to write one. 40 years he had lived on the mountain, and at the end of it he had gone into the ground with a stone that said only that he had existed, and not one soul at the funeral. The man at the church told her, not one, because by the time he died there was no one left who remembered him as anything but the strange old recluse who never came down. Eleanor stood at the grave for a long time in the gray afternoon. She had not known him. She had met him twice in 50 years, and yet she felt, standing over his plain stone, that she had come to know him better than anyone alive, because she had walked his house and read his hand and gone down into the dark he had guarded, and she understood at last what it had cost him and why he had paid it. She had brought something with her. From the wooden box on the mantel, she had taken one card, the last one, the one Walter had sent the Christmas before he died, and she set it against the base of the weathered stone, out of the wind, a kind word laid down at last where the man who had treasured it for so long could keep it. She did not say very much. She was not a woman for speeches, even to the dead. But before she left, she put her aching hand flat against the cold stone, the way she had laid it against the gold in the deep, and she told him, quietly, that he had not been forgotten after all, and that the house was full of light again, and that he could rest now, because the keeping was done, and the right hands had it, and it had all, in the end, been worth it. Aldercroft House stands restored now, on the high ground above Ledford, its great stone bones brought back from the edge of ruin, its roof whole, its windows full of light in the evenings where for 40 years there had been only the single lamp of a lonely old man. The forest no longer creeps against its walls. The drive is open. The dogs, people say, will climb it now without stopping and walk right up to the door. And that, more than anything, more than the lawyers or the appraisers or the number at the bottom of the page, is how the valley knows that whatever had its hand on that mountain for 100 years has finally let go. An old woman lives there, with her granddaughter when the girl is home from the school that the fortune pays for, and a caretaker in the gatehouse who knows the house's every mood. And on the mantel of the great hall there is a plain wooden box of Christmas cards that she will not let anyone touch. She is older now, and her hands ache more than they did, and she is not, whatever the valley likes to say, a woman who was made happy by becoming rich. She was made happy by being needed, and by being believed in by one stubborn girl, and by saving a thing that everyone else had given up for dead, and by learning, late in a long, hard life, that the meek and the overlooked and the faithful are not always overlooked forever, and that sometimes, if they hold on, if they climb the hill when no one else will, the dark gives up its secrets to them after all. That is the whole of it. An old man who guarded a fortune with his life and gave it, at the end, to the one person who had ever sent him a kind word. A widow the world had written off, who climbed a mountain because she had nowhere else to go, and found at the bottom of it everything she had ever needed, and more than that, found herself. And a girl who believed. They said the old mansion was cursed. They had said it for 100 years, the whole valley, certain of it, content with it, never once climbing the hill to see. And they were wrong, all of them, from the very beginning. It was never cursed. It was only waiting. Waiting through all the long, dark years for someone to come who was not afraid of it, who would look at the ruin and the riddle and the lonely guarded darkened sea, where everyone else saw a curse, a thing that simply, desperately, needed to be loved. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.